For this video, I want to do a brief introduction to Bonhoeffer's ethics as a work, and then we'll jump into the particular reading of the text. The ethics book, as it comes to us, is really a collection of the unfinished notes for a book that Bonhoeffer had left upon his arrest. At the time of the writing of those notes, Bonhoeffer had already been employed by the Abwehr. Those notes were then collected and edited and published by Eberhard Bethge in 1949. So the work that we have in ethics is not the book Bonhoeffer wrote. The book Bonhoeffer wrote, he never got around to writing. He only left us notes, and those notes are edited by Bethge. Most folks read ethics as a radical departure from the approach that Bonhoeffer had taken in discipleship, particularly a certain reading of ethics allows people to say that Bonhoeffer rejected nonviolence and therefore participated in the plots to assassinate Hitler. As you know, I reject that reading of Bonhoeffer's works. I think it's a misreading of Bonhoeffer, both in light of his own life and in light of the evidence, literary evidence that we have in the text itself. There are basically 3 editions of the work that are available. The most popular is the one that Bethge edited and was translated into English and published in 1963. That work you see there on the far right, simple cover, black cover. It's probably the most popular translation of Bonhoeffer's Ethics in English available. It's the one that, on Amazon's probably the cheapest. In 1995, that work was edited and fixed up in terms of the English translation. It was modernized a bit and published or republished by Macmillan. That's probably the one that you're going to find most often, the 1995 edition. In 2009, the official Bonhoeffer Works project translated ethics into English, and it's available from Fortress Press. In my opinion, that's the best translation there is. It's the one from which I'll be reading as we go forward. Is the 6th volume of Bonhoeffer's works in English. Bonhoeffer in ethics takes up quite early the 3 different types of philosophical ethics that you kind of have to keep in mind as you read through the book. There's the Kantian position, which is the position of an ethics of duty. There is this unconditional obligation that's binding in every circumstance, regardless who you are, regardless where you are, regardless what you want out of ethics. The Kantian principle is, this ethic of it applies to everyone, everywhere, all the time. Then there's the utilitarian ethic, which is you weigh the pros and cons of an action, and the judgment that's the most pros, well, that's the one you take. a morally right position to take is the one where it's the greatest benefit for the most people. You can sacrifice one life to save many, is the idea there. Then there's the virtue ethics position, classically put out by Aristotle, picked up by Aquinas in the Middle Ages. The virtue position is less concerned about particular actions, what's right, what's not right, and more concerned with the character of the actor, whether a person is good or virtuous versus whether they're evil or corrupt. That Aristotelian notion of character ethics is the one that Bonhoeffer is going to pick up on. But he's going to reframe that in terms of Jesus Christ. That ethics for Bonhoeffer is founded on the reconciliation of the world to God in Jesus. And if you want to know what it's like to be a virtuous person, there's not some philosophical category. There's Jesus Christ. So for Bonhoeffer, everything is reframed, recast, grounded in his Christology. To share in Christ's reality is to become a responsible person, a person who performs actions in accordance with the reality and the fulfilled will of God, to quote Bonhoeffer. For Bonhoeffer, the will of God in any concrete situation is known in two ways, one of which is Jesus Christ. And that's not just what Jesus taught, but it's who Jesus is. And the second way for determining the will of God in a concrete situation is the need of one's neighbors. And for Bonhoeffer, that's not just you look at your neighbor and you see what they need. It's you look at your neighbor and you see what they need, and you respond in the way that Jesus would respond. So for Bonhoeffer, ethics is fundamentally a theological activity. It's fundamentally a statement about who God is in Jesus Christ, what God does in the world in Jesus Christ, and therefore what God calls us to do in the world in Jesus Christ. There is therefore no moral certainty to be had in the world. You can't justify your actions in advance. You can't say what's the good thing to do or what's the right thing to do in a way that is not grounded in Jesus Christ. Because as disciples, we are always submitting obediently to the call of Jesus Christ in the real world. And that submissive response requires God's grace and mercy. If you attempt to justify your actions without any reference to Jesus and to following Jesus, it's just quite simply sin. There is no ethical position that is made outside of obedience to Jesus Christ. And of course, what that's going to do for Bonhoeffer is condemn the way in which German political life is, decisions in political life are made without that recognition of submission to Jesus Christ. That's what makes ethics for Christians so risky. We're always having to rely on God. Before God, self-justification is quite simply sin, Bonhoeffer writes. There's no way to justify ourselves without relying on God's grace and mercy. So any Christian ethic has to talk about grace and mercy, but does so within the context of the real world, the world in which we live. Evil's out there, and we have to oppose it. There's no option. If you just ignore it, then you're condoning it. You have to actively engage with the world as you live as disciples of Jesus. What I want to do for just a minute is to kind of frame ethics in relationship to all of Bonhoeffer's previous works. Now, we've not read them all. We only read Discipleship. But this will help you kind of see the progression of Bonhoeffer's thinking and how one thing led to the other. The way in which Bonhoeffer has lived as a theologian kind of grows out of the life that he lives. What he says in his work is a natural growth, but is consistent, and I would argue it's even persistent. That his appeal to Jesus Christ and to discipleship to Jesus Christ lasts through his life. That never changes. What he envisions for the church as those who respond to the call of Jesus Christ in discipleship never changes. He begins, of course, with his first doctoral dissertation, Sanctorum Communio. The two basic questions of Sanctorum Communio: what's a person and what is the church? Both of those can only be answered in terms of relational language. Who I am as a person is who I am in relationship to others. I exist for others. The church is defined as Christ existing in community with and for others. So Bonhoeffer develops this really robust theology of humanity and robust theology of the church that I would argue sets the stage for ethics, because in Sanctorum Communio it's all about relationship. Now, unfortunately, that's not a very accessible work, and it's not an easily accessible work. Lots of people never read it. Lots of people don't even know about it, and it's hard to find. But I would encourage you; it's well worth it to work through Sanctorum Communio. His second doctoral dissertation, Act and Being, he deals with the three fundamental categories of sin, guilt, and conscience. Conscience is the most important in Act and Being because, again, Act and Being is written in the late 20s, and obviously it's post-World War I, and Act and Being deals with conscience not as it was traditionally perceived. Because as Germans traditionally perceived conscience, and I think most people even today would think of conscience as, God's still silent voice inside of us. Bonhoeffer said that's not true. Bonhoeffer said that conscience is this active listening to the Holy Spirit in community. It is literally knowing with. That's the root. The Latin root of the word. It's literally a knowing with others of what God's desire is in the world. And that's most fully recognized in Jesus Christ. So while this notion that, conscience is this still small voice, Bonhoeffer rejects that idea because that idea ultimately leads to Nazism. This idea that God's still small voice inside of me, and I'm following that. That's how the Nazis defended themselves at Nuremberg. I'm just following orders. I'm doing exactly what I've been told to do because it's what God wanted me to do. By the time he gets to his teaching posts, Creation and Fall is basically his lectures from Genesis, written in the early 30s. Creation and Fall is this rejection of a common Lutheran notion of the orders of creation. That there was established in creation these fundamental orders or rankings or ways of perceiving the world that just naturally exist in the world, and Bonhoeffer rejects that. Bonhoeffer says that this loyalty to these fundamental ideas, these fundamental rankings of the universe, is a way of rejecting the Nazi notion that you have to be obedient to the state, obedient to the nation, obedient to the race, obedient to the fatherland. Bonhoeffer insisted that instead of orders of creation, there are orders of preservation. And these orders of preservation are the way in which Christ preserves the world in sin. That God is actively working in Jesus Christ to confront death and sin and hell, and that intervention in the world is fundamentally the work of God in Jesus Christ. And that's how you have to view God's activity in the world. Creation and fall, of course, is Bonhoeffer's interpretation of Genesis 1 through 3. And that in and of itself is a rather controversial thing to do in Germany in the 1930s, because it's dealing with a Jewish text on fundamentally Christological terms. That's just unheard of in Germany in the 1930s. It's also one of those, it's a little book, very small book, that if you ever get a chance to read through, I would encourage you to work through it. Creation and Fall is great. And if you want to know what it looks like for Bonhoeffer to deal with the biblical text verse by verse, Creation and Fall is where you go. His Christology lectures, which are really the Christology book that we have in English, it's usually translated Christ the Center. His Christology lectures are really student notes of Bonhoeffer's lectures, edited into a book form. But in those lectures, again, they're very brief. I'd say it's 100 pages. I would find a copy of that. Christology is this fundamental rejection of the classic German liberal notion that theology is entirely anthropocentric. That is, theology is about human beings, what humans believe about God. And he rejects that outright. He said that this notion that theology is fundamentally about what it means to be human, or thinking humanly about God, it led Germans to focus on Jesus' humanity over his divinity. He's a great moral teacher, or he's some ideal to hold up. And the notion of Jesus becomes rather redundant. Jesus is just a good German by the time you get done with classical German liberalism. So rather than taking that classic German liberal approach, Bonhoeffer insists that Jesus is the center of all that we know about God. And if you want to talk about God, you have to begin with Jesus. If you want to talk about what God does in the world, you have to begin with Jesus. You can't begin with Abraham. You can't begin with German life and identity. You have to begin with Jesus. So Bonhoeffer's Christology is a reminder that Jesus Christ is the center. you can't manipulate theology to shape what you want to describe about the world or about God. You have to start with the radical particularity of Jesus Christ. And of course, discipleship offers what is a very robust notion of Christianity. Bonhoeffer is not concerned with whether you're going to hell when you die, heaven when you die. He looks at the very gritty reality of the world in which he lives and talks about the radical call of Jesus Christ in that world and how that call brings a break with the world and how that call is then a radical shift for what it means to live as the church in the world. Discipleship has nothing to do with, classic liberal German Lutheran inward piety, and has everything to do with how we live our lives in the world, for others, with others, even in death, or even to death. Life Together and Psalms. Psalms is really small, 40, 50 pages. Well worth it. Prayer Book of the Bible, is Bonhoeffer's title of it. Life Together and Prayer Book of the Bible were both written to shape how students would experience life at the Finkenwalde Seminary. But those two works together talk about the way in which Bonhoeffer understands worship and about living together in Christian community. He has a famous quote in Psalms that only who cries out for the Jews can sing the Gregorian chant. If you're going to learn to worship, you have to use Psalms, and of course you have to recognize just how radical a notion that is. Again, in Germany in the late 30s, that Bonhoeffer is using a Hebrew text, a Jewish text, to talk about Christian worship. He rejects that very inward, empty German piety because he said it leads to a cold intellectual faith. Instead, deep piety, the life together in the community, and life together in worship leads not only to good theology, but it leads to good practice. It leads to change lives in the real world. So we're going to read Life Together, but Psalms, if I can get access to a digital copy, we may read it too when we get to Life Together. Those two works, unfortunately, of Bonhoeffer's works, you really don't get read all that often in the church, particularly the evangelical church in America. But those are the two most necessary, I think. From Life Together and Prayer Book of the Bible, we move to ethics. Having dealt with orthodoxy, proper Christian faith in discipleship, and orthopathy, what it means to love God and worship God in Life Together and in the Prayer Book, he moves to what would be considered orthopraxy, that is, right practice. So instead of talking about what is good and evil, Bonhoeffer reshapes it to who is Jesus Christ and what does he do in the world today? And by extension to that, what must the church do to participate in what God does in Jesus Christ? He does this by asking two questions in ethics. What's the penultimate and what's the ultimate? Who should we be and what should we do now? and what is God's will for the world. So you'll find in Bonhoeffer these really fundamental critiques of important ethical thinkers like Nietzsche and Karl Barth and Dostoevsky. So no bones about it. Ethics is a complicated little work. It's deep, it's immense, and there's a lot in it, but it's well worth it. Bonhoeffer uses his own context, his own historical context, as a way of bringing out the fundamental issues involved. Who is Jesus Christ in our own context? What does obedience and participation in Him look like in the real world? Where do we see God's mercy in our faithlessness and hope for our guilt? That makes ethics probably the most important pastoral work that he really left. But it's also one of the most sustained meditations on what political life looks like for Christians as Christians in the 20th century and even into the 21st. So as we turn to ethics, keep those two questions in mind. You're going to see a lot about the penultimate. You're going to see a lot about the ultimate. And you need a way to hang those on a tag. So the penultimate, who should we be and what should we do now? And the ultimate, what is God's will for the world? Those are the two primary questions Bonhoeffer is going to deal with in ethics. Again, if you don't have a copy, try to get one over the next few days. We're going to start reading Bonhoeffer's Ethics over the next few weeks. I'm going to take my time with it because it is that important and it's that dense. There's a lot in there, and it takes a lot to unpack. Be prepared to read through a passage several times just to make sure you've gotten what he's actually saying. So go ahead and get a copy of Bonhoeffer's Ethics. I would encourage you to get the edition that's out there from the the 2009 translation, Bonhoeffer's Ethics from the English Works. There's a reader's edition out there from Fortress Press that is that translation that's pretty cheap. I think you can get it for like $15 on Amazon. So I would honestly, if you don't have a copy, that's the copy I would get, is the 2009 translation. If you have any comments or questions about ethics as a whole and how ethics kind of fits into all of Bonhoeffer's other works, obviously leave it in response to the video. We'll move forward with ethics next week.